Hi, this is Paul, and I'm going to be doing some traveling in the next few months. It's been really nice to be doing no traveling since December and just stay here at home in Sacramento. But end of May, that all ends. End of May, I'm going to Austin, Texas for an estuary event in Austin, Texas in collaboration with Rigel. So if you know Rigel, he and some other friends of his have set this up. So I will be in Austin, Texas that weekend and for an estuary event on Thursday night. So if you're interested in that, I'll put the link below. You can come and see me there. Also, London, June 19 to 21, I will be in London, England for the Breakwater Festival. And it's a biggie. As someone said recently in a thing, they thought this was the, this could be, I don't know if people-wise it'll be bigger than Midwestuary, but this is a big group. I'll be there with Nathan Jacobs, Jared Smith, Joe Fawley will be there, Elizabeth Oldfield. The beauty about doing this thing in London is that all these Brits are there already. Glenn Scrivener will be there. Bethel McGrew will be there. Nemo the Mormon will be there. Cassidy will be there. And I think there's actually, she's continuing to add people onto the mix. This is going to be an event you don't want to miss. And so I'm going to go to that event. I have not yet decided if I'm going to ARC. If I don't go to ARC, and I'm trying to see if my wife wants to come with me. If my wife comes with me, we'll probably do some more touring around the UK. But if not, I might do some other things around ARC, have some estuary meetings, things like that. So that is the weekend before ARC. The weekend after ARC, I will be in Ireland. And we are going to Kildare. And I will be doing an event with Heather Paulington and Father Connor McDonough, who I did something last time I was in Ireland with. And I actually met Heather for the first time at ARC last time. So I am super excited about both of these events. This is going to be probably a smaller event, 120 total attendees. There'll be, there's going to be music. There's going to be sort of a walk. This is all around the stuff around St. Bridget, like her sites. And so this is just going to be tremendously fun. And so that's the weekend after. That's the Saturday after ARC, and the Breakwater is going to be the week before. So, and I still haven't decided what I'm going to do in the middle of that week, because it looks like I'm probably not doing ARC. And so I'll have some other things I want to do. So anyway, that's all coming up. Okay, now on to the main thing. Algo is pretty good at surfacing conversations with Ross Douthat. This is one with Derek Thompson. Derek Thompson writes for The Atlantic, and politically he's sort of over in the Blue Church on the left, and Douthat is in the right. This was a really good conversation, and a few things came through. One of the things was just how poorly the left understands the right. That was really clear in listening to Derek Thompson. And part of it was not just what Derek Thompson said, because he basically made a lot of points that I hear a lot of other friends and family that are sort of on the left make. And I don't even consider myself on the right. I'm sort of in the middle, I guess. But I thought this was a great conversation. The whole conversation was good, but I wanted to pick up on some things. So let's go here.
Okay. Popularity in just a second.
Okay.
I want to make sure I get the articulation of this question right. I'm thinking back to your description of the role that Trump played in 2015 when he first articulated this criticism of George W. Bush and neoconservatism. It seemed to give voice.
Now, they had just been talking about the way. This was actually really interesting for me, because back when I was sort of looking at the post, the run up to the First World War, the 19th century, I was thinking a lot about the way, and of course we've talked about the post-war consensus, where we're going to talk about more in this video, a lot of the ways that wars just sort of reshape things. And so the Vietnam War sort of killed a certain element of the Democratic Party. People forget that Nixon came into office really with a mandate to get us out of Vietnam. Americans have, I know some of you around the world, because when you listen to people around the world talk about America, they talk about America like this, militaristic country that's always blowing up stuff. And fair enough. But most Americans are sort of predisposed to isolationism. We don't want to send our young man off into foreign wars. I mean, this is right at the founding of the nation. One of the last things that George Washington said when he decided to be a president, not a king, and only stay in for 2 terms, he said, "Stay out of European wars." And so America tried to stay out of the First World War. America tried to stay out of the Second World War. America has a checkered history of staying out of these wars. But once after the Second World War, the United States as this global empire, well, then once the world is sort of your imperial in your imperial realm, well, then you have to police it. And America's been doing that kind of policing. But the Vietnam War sort of broke America in a particular way. The George W. Bush's Iraq War and Afghanistan sort of broke America in a particular way. And so part of the rule that, part of the attraction that Trump was that they had a really lot of, so much talk around Trump is so boring because it's so predictable. Both sides sort of say what they want about Trump. And so often it's just so dull. But this wasn't dull because there are a lot of good insights into not so much Trump, who frankly it's not that hard to map. It's all the dynamics around Trump that are much more interesting. So the fact that Derek Thompson said, I didn't think I'd ever see the Trump coalition break up, but it's like all American political coalitions break up. And the fact that a war is doing it is, maybe, but the war isn't over. And so you have to wait and see how this war ends. If Trump sort of gets us out of this war and gets the straits open, and Americans have attention spans like a gnat. And then as long as the gas prices come down and everything sort of stays normal in America, I know it's hard for the rest of the world and rather obnoxious for the rest of the world to know, but as long as stuff is just sort of regular in America and we don't have to pay attention to anything but us, we're a deeply narcissistic country in many ways. As long as we don't have to pay attention to anything but us, we're happy. And then we just fight amongst ourselves about the things that we fight about. But let's keep going because I thought this was good.
To a strain of Republican vote criticism of George W. Bush and neoconservatism, it seemed to give voice to a strain of Republican voters who previously were not spoken for. And in a way, and I hope this isn't too much of a stretch, you can almost see the role that Trump played here as being entrepreneurial. It's the same way that a startup discovers a demand in the marketplace not previously met by a product and invents a product that meets that need and then becomes a unicorn, $1 billion company.
I remember when I was in college, I don't know if it was Hofstadter, a very famous American historian, but I remember this from my history classes at Calvin. Ron Wells was my professor for American history. That was sort of my concentration, was American history. The business of America is business. America is best understood as a marketplace, and that's true religiously, it's true politically. That's sort of what America is about. America is a marketplace, and we see things through that lens. Now, also sort of these middle spirits work in that marketplace. And I thought this observation that what Trump managed to do was coalesce a group of, people that you really couldn't fit together around him. And, again, we have to give the Democratic Party its due. It completely it put forward Hillary Clinton, a candidate that everyone knew was unpopular, and then it completely botched the 2024 election. With Joe Biden, who should have basically stuck to, he never actually said it, should have stuck to one term and then let the Democrats have a primary. But I think it's also important to note that in some ways, part of the reason the Republican Party is doing better is because, and I know Democrats, it's going to gall them to hear this, but the Republicans are in some ways doing better at keeping up with the times. The Democrats have this vision of progressivism that is basically the continual updating of the post-war consensus, and it's just losing steam. And so the Republicans are sort of a chaotic group that's feeling around. And I think Thompson is right that Trump sort of was able to kind of capture a bunch of this energy and have it around him.
Trump was similarly discovering in this messy combination of kingly, braggadocious behavior, anti-neoconservatism, and you mentioned this too, interestingly moderate positions on ideas like Medicare and Social Security. This part of the Republican Party that was previously not spoken for. I wonder if you think Tucker Carlson, Candace Owens, maybe even to a certain extent, a bit of Megyn Kelly, doing the same thing in 2026 that Trump was doing in 2015.
Now, right there, a whole bunch of you just reacted with those three. And I don't even know enough about conservative chatter or all of that because I hear in places these three names bandied about, and I don't know hardly anything about any of the three of them. I don't know. I probably have never not watched. Now I've watched a couple hours of Tucker Carlson, and that's going to come up a little bit later. But I've never listened to anything from Candace Owens. I just know her by reputation. And I've listened to almost nothing from Megyn Kelly. I've never watched Fox News. I've never done any of that. But when he asked this question, what was in me was, dude, you think that Tucker Carlson, Megyn Kelly, and Candace Owens are sort of the voice of the future of the Republican Party? Do you think they have that much clout? And let's see. I think they're going to talk about, let's just go, because it was really good.
In 2016, discovering and pointing to, illuminating the size of and the presence of a constituency in the Republican Party that previously wasn't being served. Like, maybe there's this wing of Republican voters who are more anti-Semitic, who are more isolationist, who are significantly more conspiratorial even than...
See, and I think part of the reason that Thompson is having a hard time seeing like normal American who's leaning conservative or vote for Trump, he's just seeing them through the projection of his fears and biases. They're racist. They're clinging to their guns and religion. I mean, we've had all of these moments where both parties sort of project their stereotypes and their fears at the other side and don't see them clearly, which is why it's good that these two at least seem to have a decent reputation or decent relationship. And Douthat, every time I listen to Douthat, his stock just goes up in my mind.
The president and his administration are providing for, speaking for. Is there a way in which this emerging criticism of Trump and the Iran war might be an omen for where the Republican Party is going?
So, yes, but you don't want to overstate what's happening. You have a podcast. I have a podcast. Neither of our podcasts, to my knowledge, are as large as Tucker Carlson's podcast. I don't know what your current numbers are, so I don't want to impute anything, right? But you and I both have a sense of like what it means to have a podcast audience. What it means to have a podcast audience is different from what it means to win the Republican primary in Iowa. which Trump didn't do actually originally, but let's say win the Republican primary in New Hampshire or South Carolina, right? The Iowa caucuses are their own thing. And I think it's absolutely the case that the sort of anti-Trump Republican podcasters, right-wing podcasters, have both developed and discovered an audience that is, as you describe it, more paranoid, conspiratorial, less like ideologically conservative in a traditional way, more open to anti-Semitism, more skeptical of Israel, even if they aren't anti-Semitic. Absolutely, 100%. How big is that audience? That's a different question, right? Like, if you have 1 million fans for your podcast, you have a really successful podcast, but you do not have a coalition that's about to take over the Republican Party. And again, to go back to what I said to you at the outset, right? Like, you don't see in the polls millions and millions of Republicans abandoning Trump over Iran. You see a drip, drip, drip downward in his support. And I think that goes back, just to go back to what you were saying about him being entrepreneurial. Part of what Trump did was basically make it safe for a certain kind of normal mainstream Republican who had liked George W. Bush to embrace a critique of Bush without feeling like he was becoming a pacifist or a true isolationist, right? Like Trump was like, we're not going to do any stupid wars, but we're going to be the toughest people on the block, right? And that combination, I think it's still holding some of his support, right? There's plenty of Republicans who, had Trump not gone into Iran, would have said, well, that was a good idea. But once he went into Iran, we're like, well, he must know what he's doing and let's hope he wins, right? And those people are not all listening to Tucker and getting blackpilled on Trump. They're still sort of waiting it out, waiting to see what happens. Some of them could leave Trump if the economy tanks and so on, but they don't represent a constituency that's like there for full bore conspiracy theory world, let alone, again, like Candace Owens has constructed this kind of weekly, daily running soap opera about like the internal realities of right-wing podcasting, right? Where it's like, Erica Kirk is this character. And, that, again, there's a lot of people who clearly enjoy listening to that. Is that a coalition that's going to take over the Republican Party? I'm skeptical. Now, part of it also, though, depends on the last podcast I did, besides my own before this interview, was with Dan Senior, who's a long time Jewish.
All right, I don't want to let the point go by about size, because yes, if you have a YouTube channel with 1 million or even a few million subscribers on it, you think that's a huge deal. But if you actually have a YouTube channel and you look at the subscriber number, Speak Life just recently went over 100,000, and they had a little party, and Glenn basically said, that subscriber number is sort of like, people look at you, if you totaled up how much money, let's say I'm 62 years old, if I totaled up how much money I have had that have passed through my bank accounts are under my control my entire lifetime, and you looked at that amount of money, you'd say, wow, he's a rich guy. But if you look at what's in my bank account today, you would not be terribly impressed. And YouTube subscriber numbers are like that. The YouTube subscriber number is a recording of just how many people hit that subscribe number at one point and have never bothered to unsubscribe. And so you actually have to look at video counts. But even video counts, YouTube will tell you what percentage of your video counts are people who are subscribed and people who aren't. And so there's all of these metrics. And so basically the point there is that in some ways, all of these things are living in different worlds. And just because people listen to something or watch something or care about something, people are hugely complex. It doesn't necessarily mean they're going to vote a certain way or do a certain thing. So
Republican, pro-Israel, sort of very conventional George W. Bush era Republican is how I describe him. And to him, I wanted to convince him that anti-Israel sentiment and anti-Semitism on the right is real and a big deal. And I do think it's real, and I do think it's a big deal. So I want to stipulate that. I think that the turn on Israel among younger Republicans is real and substantial and important. But,
and we should note that if you see this sort of through the lens of the post-war consensus, part of what the post-war consensus afforded, it afforded good things and bad things, let's just say that. Part of what it afforded is sort of a pervasive prophylactic against anti-Semitism in the culture. Because to be anti-Semitic, if the devil of the post-war consensus was Hitler, to be anti-Semitic was to be Team Hitler. And so some people, of course, went there because they didn't even necessarily know any Jews or feel any way about them, but they wanted to be rebels. And so that's how they could gain identity and status and a community and all of those things. But for most people, they didn't. And so as that post-war consensus sort of recedes, that prophylactic against anti-Semitism also begins to recede. So we're probably seeing, as sort of the larger trends are, a return to normalcy, let's say before the Second World War, which is much more lion energy in terms of civilizations, tribalism, breaking down of globalization. You see that in the Iran war, where shipping is going down, less trade, more protectionism. I mean, we're just seeing these massive changes going through the world that are going to impact all sorts of other things.
Talking to you, I also want to convince you that, like, Tucker Carlson hasn't discovered necessarily the thing that wins Republican primaries in the future. The sort of intensity of Carlson's commitment to, chemtrails one week, right? And, vaccine skepticism the next, and anti-Israel sentiment the next, like, that still seems like a narrower thing to me.
It's a good reminder.
Now, I'm going to talk about Tucker Carlson a little bit later because we're getting to him through Brett Weinstein, through an email that someone sent me. This guy was on the Bridges Meeting Discord for a long time, and actually I knew him before. He was the one that turned me on to Vervaeke. So, but we'll keep going with this.
A riff that I sometimes go on to remind people about scales of popularity in culture is, if your book sells 100,000 copies, it's a bestseller.
You're amazing.
If a movie sells 100,000 tickets, it's an unbelievable flop. That movie only makes barely over $1 million a year.
That is such a huge point that he made right there. I know pastors who have written books, and usually the books are like a compilation of their sermons, and they sold dozens of them. And this is part of the reason when I talk to published authors, they look at me and like, you've got 34,000 subscribers. And it's like, yeah, but the money in the bank thing. And I look at them as like, you've written a book, because the book and the YouTube and the podcast and the movie and the political things, they're all living in different silos. They're all living in different economies. And what we tend to do in a rather low resolution way is just sort of look at those numbers and not appreciate what exactly those numbers might be telling us. And, we have this with respect to, let's say, the Orthodox moment in America. And, many people who are in Orthodoxy will fess up to this, partly because, 1% of people who go to church in America go to an Orthodox church, maybe 2. Compare that with Catholics, Baptists, Methodists, and now the big new one, non-denominational. I mean, it's almost a rounding error for pollsters. But that doesn't mean it's not important and not significant and not important to us. But, we all stand, and this is part of what my friend made the point too, we all stand in a place looking out. A lot of the comments, now today I released the Jonathan Pageau conversation. Some of the interesting comments on that about nobody's really had a good conversation with Jonathan Pageau about postmodernity. And, Jonathan was pretty frank when he talked about Peterson's perspective on it. And again, my thesis that this Orthodox moment that we're in, this wave of orthodoxy coming in, at least to a degree, this is powered by the emerging church movement, which itself was powered by the coming of postmodernity. Postmodernity also powered the woke movement. And it's just that these massive waves have impacts in all sorts of ways, which are often surprising, but it's important to sort of watch the trend. And again, that's part of what was interesting here, because Derek Thompson's thesis is that part of what happens in politics is that you see the rise of someone like Donald Trump, and that tells you a whole bunch of things, but the individuals are catalysts too. One of the comments that I got on the Brett Weinstein videos was a really good comment on a biologist, and that sort of like Michael Levin. So much of what's happening in biology now, and I think in all the rest of the sciences, this is part of the recession of modernity, is that there's an increasing awareness of the verticality that's in the universe. We've seen this in, where John Vervaeke has how he's developed. Jonathan Pageau's been a big piece of this, but we're seeing it all over. And because modernity sort of flattened everything, postmodernity sort of takes a critical eye and a deconstructing look at that. But what's happening, that all of these things that we've been a part of is just this new advent of verticality in the culture.
So a movie has to sell tens of millions of tickets to be popular. In order to win a presidency, you have to win 60, 70 million votes all at once. So the scale of popularity, as you go from, say...
But it's really important to recognize that political candidates stand on platforms, and these platforms have enormous power. The Democratic platform, the Republican platform. And it helps that it's a binary. It's one, not the other. And of course, famously, third-party efforts usually fail in America. But politicians, like right now, we're going to have our primary June 2 for the governorship of California. California a while ago decided that it wasn't going to have party primaries anymore. It was just going to have one primary that everybody goes into, and then the top two go on to the finals. But, the Dems always imagined that the top two would be Dems, but when there are so few Republicans, and if there's a strong Republican candidate or two strong Republican candidates, it could be, because the Republican Party is so smaller, that the top two people on the runoff election for the governor of California might be a Republican. And so there's not quite as much chatter as there was about in California about that before, but there's some of that now. So it's really funny how these systems work. And when you look at, I think CNN is going to have the California gubernatorial debate on CNN. And they're all unknowns. Now, if you pay attention to California politics, you probably know some of them, or maybe even all of them. But most of you in the rest of the country, you won't know anybody on that ticket. In other words, none of them. But then how would we measure their fame against, let's say, the fame of someone like Joe Rogan? Because people are local. And, I was watching one person talk about the current Iran war. And part of what's going on in the Iran war is that war is all about locality. It's all about geography. And that's a constant thing in war. If you look at the First World War, I mean, why can't I think of the World War? It's great when I don't think of something, because y'all put it right in the comments and it helps the algorithm. But the attempt to sort of of the British to capture the Dardanelles and that area. It's a fascinating piece of that war, because even though nobody pays attention to it, if if what happened in the Balkans and in what today is Turkey went differently in the First World War, and let's say the Russians got a hold of Constantinople, wow, world history would have been insanely different if the Russians didn't have this tremendous problem of bottlenecks. So, I mean, history is just full of this kind of stuff.
Books to movies to politics changes quite significantly, and podcasting, I suppose, is somewhere in there. The sort of second chapter of the conversation that I want to open up here is that I see several tensions within the MAGA coalition being stressed right now. I feel like the first half of this conversation is really focused on this tension between, say, a faith in Trump's isolationism, his critique of neoconservatism, and a faith in Trump as Trump, right? A kind of cult of personality. Whatever you do, that's fine with me. If you want to invade Iran, that sounds great. If you want to express the idea that invading Iran is a betrayal of American interests, that also sounds fine with me. It's almost like there's a part of the Trump coalition that waits for him to act before deciding what is the public good. So that's one tension between the cult of personality and an ideology of isolationism. But there's other tensions that I want to talk about with you. The next tension, I think, is very much up your alley. It's the tension between the Republican Party being the Christian party in America and Trump being a barbarian president. And I think there's several levels at which you can analyze this. One level is...
And just saying that the Republican Party is the Christian party. Wow. But this is, you know, this is why I haven't made a video with this title, but the question, is Christian a broken adjective? I mean, in some ways, the whole Tom Holland thesis says, if that word doesn't distinguish two things, it's a broken adjective. It's a broken word in the culture. I don't think it's completely broken. I think it still says some things, but part of what has happened over the last number of years is that, in fact, and I think mass media bears a lot of the blame, they just simply started imagining that all church-going people go to vote one way. And survey after survey, just look at Ryan Burge's work. Just look at the Pew's work. Survey after survey after survey basically say, it's not true. Now, Christians are, people who identify as Christians are pretty well distributed over both political parties. Because, you know, and the most Christian demographic in North America are African Americans, and you know how they vote. So this, you know, he's continuing to propagate this line that Christians in America are certain kinds of evangelicals. Now, this has been moving, and what he says about Catholic votes are really interesting. But again, you're running sort of fast and loose with a lot of things, because a lot of people, and this is always part of the problem with surveys, a lot of people identify as Catholic and never go to church. It's quite likely that Catholicism in America is, especially as it's getting younger, the younger reaches of Catholicism in America are getting more and more conservatives. The same thing happened in the Christian Reformed Church. But church participation and religious identification are two wholly different things, especially when we sort of pull back the frame, which is a lot of what's been happening culturally, where ask somebody in Saudi Arabia and they'll say Americans are Christians. Ask someone in Seattle, Washington, and say, what percentage of the population around you is Christian and what percentage is regular? I hardly know any Christians. I mean, that's where these words just completely fail us. And so he's sort of shopping a stereotype here, but all right, we'll keep going.
This was just breaking news from a few weeks ago. White Catholics side overwhelmingly with the Republican Party. I believe they're something like plus 25, plus 30.
White Catholics. Okay, if you're using your demographic, is that demographic of white Catholics growing? Or do you distinguish Hispanic Catholics? or Asian Catholics? Or how about how many immigrants are coming from Poland? I don't know. The Irish pipeline is long done. So again, you're sort of trading in some stereotypes here, but it's really fast and loose, which that's not a sin, but he's a journalist and he's written about religion. So, he should probably have Ryan Burge on his podcast, as Ross Douthat did.
The Republican voters. The president just openly feuded with the Catholic Pope. And so that, I think, exposed a tension within the party. But the tension also exists at the level of personnel. When you look at the administration or the spokespeople for this party, J.D. Vance, vice president, he's a Catholic convert. But Vance exists in tension with Trump, Musk, RFK.
Okay, this is so interesting. So I'm going to play Brett Weinstein talking to Tucker Carlson. And it's like a 2-hour conversation on Brett's channel. And I took out about 25 minutes of where they treat religion. Now, put a pin in this right here, because ask someone, let's say, like Derek Thompson, and say, what religion is in charge of the White House right now? And again, people tend to project their fears. They say, oh, look at Hegseth. Well, that's Christian nationalism. That's like conservative Calvinism. Is the vice president a conservative Calvinist? Is the Supreme Court filled with conservative Calvinists? You actually find that on a religious basis, they're actually quite diverse. And of course, it was so funny because, I made a comment about Obama's marriage and Trump's marriage. And the other day I rewatched the Access Hollywood tape of Trump with that guy on the bus. That's something you should rewatch every now and then, because it really sort of orients you about who Donald Trump is. Now, this is no mistake. He's never made, he was on Howard Stern. Donald Trump, until he decided to, at least for a moment, Donald Trump is Donald Trump. Has always been, will always be. You pretty much know the guy, okay? We know what he says. We know what he does. We know what he sleeps with. We know how he treats his wives. This is Donald Trump. But look around him. I mean, he's got Paula White and people like, America's being taken over by prosperity gospel people. Oh, is the vice president a prosperity gospel guy? Is Pete Hegseth a prosperity gospel guy? In association one way or another with Doug Wilson. Is Doug Wilson a prosperity gospel guy? They're all over the map. And it all depends, of course, on what map you're looking through. But you say, well, they're religious. Oh, instead of what? Yeah, if you don't go to church, you're not religious. Really? Yeah. No, not at all.
These gentlemen are not just ambivalently Christian. They are staunchly paganist. They are barbarians. They are Nietzsche's blonde beasts. Our administration or the spokespeople for this party, J.D. Vance, vice president, he's a Catholic convert. But Vance exists in tension with Trump, Musk, RFK. I mean, these gentlemen are not just ambivalently Christian. They are staunchly paganist. They are barbarians. They are Nietzsche's blonde beasts. And so I wonder how you see
Nietzsche's blonde. However you feel about him labeling him, that's some pretty powerful rhetoric.
This tension, what is the state of this tension right now in the Republican Party between the party representing overwhelmingly Christian voters in America and the last few weeks where I see definitely some, earthquake tremors in terms of the degree to which you can have a kind of pagan leader of a Christian party?
Yeah, I mean, this is a tension that Republicans have been navigating throughout the Trump era, so it's not entirely new, right? And I think you can see sort of different stages in it. You have sort of a stage where a lot of religious conservatives see themselves as supporting Trump in this kind of highly instrumental fashion, where it's like, look, our influence is diminished, we are beset and beleaguered. Trump is presenting himself as our champion, and we have to make that bargain, even if Trump himself is a heathen figure in some way. And then over time, because it's hard to live with that kind of tension, right? People sort of persuade themselves of the idea that Trump is more authentically religious or socially conservative than I think he really is. And at the same time, in Trump's first term, especially, there is, a lot of sort of conventional Republican social conservative priorities get pursued. Obviously, you have judicial appointments that lead to Roe v. Wade being overturned. When that happens, it's sort of seen as like this kind of confirmation of the conservative Christian bargain with Trump, right? So there's this very powerful sort of ceiling that SEA, right? SEAL ceiling that happens around that issue, especially judicial nominations generally, culture war stuff. And so what we're seeing now is forces and personalities that are sort of peeling that back apart to some degree. And, you see it in the administration's complete lack of interest in socially conservative causes and issues. You see it in the strangeness and complexity of figures like Musk as kind of avatars for cultural conservatism. You see it in divides over AI, I would say, where the administration is very, very pro AI and just sort of has the view that AI is just a normal technology that, we want America to be a leader in and we want to invest in and so on. And meanwhile, there's lots of cultural and religious conservatives who have a lot of anxiety about Silicon Valley and AI culture for reasons that I think are probably obvious to both of us. But do they have a voice, right? Who is their voice? Who's their voice? Maybe it's Steve Bannon, right? Like if you're looking for, maybe it's Tucker Carlson, right? Like I guess what I'm saying is I don't think there's been some dramatic unraveling. It's more that the tensions are obvious and it's unclear what happens to those tensions as we pass from Trump, the actual Trump era, into whatever comes next.
Two follow-ups on this tension, the religious tension on the right. You mentioned that you're already seeing some fissures. Are these fissures deep enough, you think, that the right Democratic candidates locally or the right Democratic presidential candidate nationally might be able to take advantage of those fissures and bring more Christians into the Democratic Party, which would be quite a shift from the last two election cycles? I mean, when I just...
Again, look at the data. There are plenty of Christians who vote Democratic. Now, people who vote Republican. I mean, and they go both ways. Now he's gonna mention, and Douthat's gonna basically, pour a bucket of cold water on this. So you think there's a chance?
Just think about some of the rising figures in the Democratic Party, like James Tallarico, and who knows what happens with his Senate campaign in Texas. I mean, there are some Democrats, I think, who are quite comfortable speaking openly about Christian values while nonetheless representing themselves as members of the progressive coalition. Are the fissures deep enough on the right, you think, that some Democrats might be able to win more Christian conservatives in the next few election cycles?
I mean, yes, to some degree. I wouldn't, but partially just in the sense that, you win more swing voters of every kind, right? So to the extent that you have people who are right-leaning churchgoers who are not, who are sort of moderate in certain ways, there's opportunities for Democrats to pick those voters up. I don't think that there is a Democratic appeal that is like especially well calibrated to, let's say, someone who is sincerely pro-life and anxious about AI and doesn't like that the Trump administration is so libertine, I don't think that the Tallarico pitch, which basically says, you know, Jesus wants you to be a Democrat and not pay so much attention to abortion and sexuality. And by the way, Tallarico has, you know, endless clips from the age of peak woke where he's like, you know, God is transgender and so on. I don't think that's well calibrated to peel off people who are profoundly in the conservative world, but are potentially alienated from Trump. I think it's more like people who are more loosely attached, who are like lukewarmly pro-life. You know, that's just sort of how these things go. You don't reach into your opponent's coalition and sort of pluck part of the heart out. You pull people from the edges. Could Democrats do better if their sort of Christian-inflected candidates sounded a little friendlier to social conservatives than Tallarico does? I think so. I think there's a constant illusion that Democrats have where it's like, if we just, you know, you saw this with Tim Walz, right? If we just nominate someone who has a certain affect or can, you know, knows the New Testament or something, then we'll win over some of the voters we're losing. No, you actually have to move a little further on specific issues. But I think the wild card here is AI, though. I think you know,
and that's my second follow up. Yeah, no,
yeah,
let me tee you up on this because
yeah, they go into that, and it's good. It's good because, you know, Douthat basically makes the point that the whole AI God question or AI sage question plays in Christians, and the whole rest of the conversation is really excellent. There's a ton of nuance in it. Douthat is absolutely tremendous. Thompson is asking great questions. It's really good, so I recommend it. But I don't want to spend my whole time just on this conversation. The point is that, and this is something that when I talk to, like I say, I'm sort of in the middle, and my friends who are like solidly on the right are always like, I can't believe you'd vote for, and then fill in the blank with every Democratic candidate. And the people on the left are exactly the opposite, but the same. I mean, it's just, that's the way it goes. But for people who live in the rest of the world, and half of my listeners don't live in the United States, Americans basically usually have, when it comes right down to it, a choice between two options. And generally speaking, they're not in love with either. And so they usually default to party or maybe even just a trivia connection that they have, or a one issue thing, or that's the way American politics works. It's just the way it works. Okay, now onto this video. Now what I did was I edited. I don't really like editing, but sometimes I have to. And so I took 22 minutes out of the 2-hour conversation between Brett and Tucker, and I put it on Vanderclips. Those of you who don't know what Vanderclips is sort of a place that I throw things that I might want to use in a video, or it doesn't go on the main channel. Usually the channel isn't monetized, but doesn't mean you won't see commercials in the videos that are there, because again, YouTube will put commercials on any video it wants to, as many commercials as it wants to. Those are the terms of service with YouTube. So if it's like, I hate YouTube ads, well, either you have to get YouTube Premium or find another way around them, because there will be ads. But maybe I should get into some of the conversations that I've had. That going into the Brett Weinstein, Jordan Hall, Jonathan Pageau thing has been interesting. And I want to read a little bit of what a friend wrote. I just put this here so, you know, there's no email to accidentally leak onto the channel. Where do you think Brett's coming from in his conversation with Jonathan and Jordan? And again, I asked sort of at the beginning of that video when I was commenting on it, you know, think about where Brett's coming from. And so this person basically said, like, why is he in this conversation in the first place? That's a really good question, because I just talked with, you know, and talking about Trump and Derek Thompson and Ross Douthat, a whole bunch of people are going to be like, well, Paul's talking politics. the politics aren't that interesting to me. If you go all the way back, when to the point that I disclose myself, I usually say I'm a religious believer and a political skeptic. I don't have a lot of faith in politics or political solutions. I don't. I really don't. I pay much more attention to religion. But that then becomes a blind spot for me because we all sort of project onto other people what we're seeing through ourselves. And this person, I think, quite rightly said, Brett comes at that conversation with Jonathan and Jordan probably much more from a political perspective. And of course, Brett's political story has been interesting because he was solidly on the left until the left left him. And that's Benjamin Boyce put that framing in it before, it's part of the left me group. And in some ways I could be part of that. But again, I'm much more tethered to religious institutions than political institutions. And religion is much more the filters I see the world through than politics, let's say. I think maybe you're missing an important point. This was before the Vulture video came out. I think maybe you're missing an important point on pieces of the puzzle for understandable reason that you don't much care about politics. But I think that Brett's recent political experience have powerfully influenced his perspective on Christianity. And I think that is really true because when you look at this whole group of people like Peter Boghossian and Lindsay and that whole anti-woke group, even though Peter Boghossian was in the new atheist camp, he's fundamentally political. And the reason that a lot of these people who were sort of isolated, Jordan Peterson, Brett Weinstein, Eric Weinstein, it was for political reasons, not religious reasons. That's sort of the dominant viewpoint through which they see the world. And it's kind of an obvious point, but it's a point that I needed to be reminded of. Because when I look at those characters, I'm looking at them from a religious perspective. And part of the reason that when, let's say, the further Jordan Peterson went from 2016 in his exile forward, the more political he became. And where his wife and daughter had religious transformations. And sort of around here in the TLC, we're way more religious talky than political talky, more cultural, social. So why did he talk to Jordan and Jonathan? Well, part of it is his career now as a YouTuber. And Jonathan is important and Jordan's a friend. So just on that measure alone, you could see where Jordan Hall would have the power to make this thing happen. But the outcomes that Brett is looking for are fundamentally political and social, not religious. And this is where those filters really matter, because that religious filter that has a vivid belief in an afterlife and motivation and, anxiety about hell. And of course, universalists might jump on and see, we'll fix it. Yeah, well, we'll see. The divide on the right is almost 100% determined by theological differences. Now, my friend here isn't, I'd say, is more philosophical, political than religious. I used to think that Brett wasn't getting it and that Jonathan and Jordan Peterson were leaps and bounds ahead of him, but now I think he's actually overtaken Jonathan, and Jonathan didn't notice. I'm not quite sure what overtaken in what regard. He'll send me an email after I make this video and let me know. Not to be mean about the Christians, thank you, but they're a bit dense sometimes, granted. I get that Christianity puts a lot of emphasis on the crucifixion and resurrection, but what do either of these things actually have to do with the wisdom that Jesus taught? See, this is where How much? I think when people think about the wisdom Jesus taught, they think about James Talarico and sort of post-war consensus, blue church, liberalism, mainline, anti-racism, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Because again, if you just sit down with the Sermon on the Mount, people read that sermon through real lenses. The sermon itself is really difficult. Does the wisdom of Jesus truly hinge only on his death and resurrection? Yes, it does. Because a lot of what Jesus taught is just simply taken from the Old Testament. A lot of it's there. It's of course tweaked and refined and reemphasized and, distilled, et cetera, et cetera. But the death and resurrection of Jesus completely transformed the story. And the only reason we pay any attention to his wisdom is the resurrection. That's what changed everything. And Bart Ehrman will admit it. Just again, look at Bart's Love Thy Stranger. Now, Bart Ehrman doesn't believe in the resurrection, but there's so much to this. This is so complex. Does the wisdom of Jesus truly hinge on the death and resurrection? No, it doesn't. Yes, it does. For that reason, appealing to the supernatural is a cop-out when it comes to explaining the virtue of Christianity. Oh, this gets into so much. It's a losing move to play. Jonathan is rehashing past battles, and for that reason, he's setting himself up for failure. By the way, I'm pretty sure that the close person to what Brett was saying, calling him a traitor, is Eric, and that comes in, I think, in the Tucker Carlson conversation. But my friend and I are on a different page here, which is normal, which makes conversations fun. Let's get into this, because I think this conversation reveals a lot about the assumptions. Well, maybe I should play a little bit of the other piece first. Let's get to the first use of the word religion in the video.
Yeah, all right. Let's try it briefly first.
Yeah. Maybe a way of thinking about it is one of the phrases that came up in our conversation was that it's an error to imagine that science and I'll just say religion are competing for the same domain.
Mm-hmm.
It is proper, and the old-fashioned phrase was that theology is the queen of the sciences. And the key thing here is to recognize that in relationship to, say, a knight, a queen is not like a bigger, stronger knight.
Mm-hmm.
The queen is one who stands next to, in fact, in some sense, particularly above the knight, that provides the knight with the context that orients the knight towards why the knight is doing what the knight is doing and how to do it properly.
Yeah.
Once you recognize that, and you recognize that both of these domains are not just compatible, but if they are separated, catastrophic, and that when they cross the streams, and when theology tries to do science, this creates all kinds of weird errors that are sometimes profoundly bad for theology because they're so absurd and so easy to undermine that then you lose track of this altogether. The same thing happens, of course, when science tries to do theology.
Okay. Now, this, of course, was when Jordan was invited to talk about his own conversion, and he gives this speech. But this speech is excellent. There's another video out there from Justin Brierley with Stephen Meyer and Phil Harper. And there's some really good stuff in this video, but a huge part of the problem is that they're not dealing with their assumptions about either science or religion. They're just using the words as if everyone is agreeing on it. And again, Brett Weinstein made the point that this disconnect with words is really a problem. And if you listen to what Jordan just said, Jordan basically just said you cannot do science properly without it being situated properly in your religion, which is why you can't just locate Jesus with his teachings. You have to locate Jesus in the context of crucifixion and resurrection, because those orient all of the teaching. And similar to what Jordan just said, the crucifixion and resurrection, let's say incarnation, crucifixion, and resurrection, sort of create the context in which the teaching makes sense. Because even if you look at the Beatitudes, I've made this point before, and people have complained about it, but I'm going to make it again because I think it's true. The Beatitudes make no sense without the incarnation, crucifixion, resurrection, ascension of Jesus. It's basically saying, blessed are the losers, for they will win. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. And anybody listening to that will say, no, the meek get the short end of the stick, a la Steve Martin in Leap of Faith. Great movie. It's all within the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus and how that plays in the larger narrative. And so what Jordan just said there is astoundingly insightful. And it's really quite remarkable where Jordan has come through his conversion. But I mean, part of the problem is we always imagine that the conversion is just sort of the product of whatever, let's say, crisis provoked it. No. And I talked about that a little bit on my sermon last Sunday. The conversion of the Philippian jailer had everything to do with his worldview, how he interpreted the exorcism that Paul accomplishes on the slave girl and the earthquake. And if you understand the worldview, the context within that exorcism and that earthquake, then you can understand what the jailer meant when he fell on his knees before Paul of Tarsus and said, tell me what I must do to be saved. And again, part of the problem is that almost everybody reading that in the Bible in this day and age in the West will hear, tell me what I need to do to go to heaven when I die. That is not what was on the Philippian jailer's mind at the moment. He was expecting to get squished, either by the people who ran the town or by Paul as an enormously powerful magician, if you will, and the patron god that had Paul's back, where this guy was just torturing him. That's the context in which the Philippian jailer, what must I do to be saved, makes sense. And the context in which the baptism makes sense. It's the context in which Jesus' moral teaching makes sense. Because on one hand, Jesus' moral teaching is in some ways in alignment with other moral teaching. And in many ways, Jesus' moral teaching doesn't make any sense unless you hate your father or mother. Nobody says that. Why would Jesus say that? Well, I interpret it. But just look at the Beatitudes. Read the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus' moral teaching is within the worldview and the context that is all embedded in the incarnation, crucifixion, resurrection, ascension of Jesus. Ascension Day is coming. That's one point. And so what Jordan notes there is that you can't just say science and religion are competing and I'll stay away from religion and I'll just live a regular life without religion. No, go back to Kevin Flatt. Religion is the operating system, not an app on your phone. Probably blown out the mic, I get yelling. But, and then in a few minutes, Brett, who gave that lovely speech about understanding language, will say, no, not religion. Okay, and this, which is why I use a word like worldview, perspective, all of these kinds of things. Now, my friend will, in a later video, say, well, not a later video, let a message. At one point in the convo, Brett is talking about getting all the religions into a conversation together in order to figure out what's useful and what's not, etc. Jonathan immediately asks him where he was standing to say something like that. But one could just as easily shoot that question back at Jonathan. Where are you standing when you raise the question? I think Jonathan would accept that perfectly. He'll say yes. We all have our presuppositions, and that's exactly what I would say. One of the comments recently said, it's interesting me listening to you about orthodoxy, but how does your Calvinism fit into this? Well, I come from a tradition that is ardently presuppositionalist, which says everything depends on where you're standing. And so if you have a worldview that says it's fundamentally a materialist and everything is just sort of plain and regular materiality, but religion is this supernatural thing over there, well, that's where you're standing. And where Jonathan is standing says no. Now, part of why you have a conversation like this is to do your best to discover not only where the other person is standing, but where you are standing, because we really don't know where we're standing until we get an understanding of where the other person is standing. And that's why we do this. Daniel Gardner made that great point about part of the reason you go out into the world is that you find yourself, you locate yourself by locating other people, which is why these kinds of conversations are so important. And even though they garner interest because they're sort of a, well, can I win you to my side? But even if Brett Weinstein would say, okay, I'm going to become a Christian tomorrow, that wouldn't necessarily win him to anyone's side, because most of his mapping and his coding will probably be like before, unless, again, Jordan Hall and the Philippian jailer, things had in fact been migrating, and then suddenly, as C.S. Lewis notes, you get to a point and then suddenly you see something in Christianity and you see this hole in your map and you fit it in and you say, now my life makes more sense. And that's in many ways what a conversion is. At least many conversions are that way. Some of them are much more dramatic and traumatic, like you think about Paul on the road to Damascus. But even those are often that thing where there's this missing piece. C.S. Lewis uses that illustration in The Grand Miracle, in that chapter in his book Miracles, where he talks about, finding a missing page of a longer symphony. And you can see this sheet makes all the rest of the symphony work better. And that's when we're redoing our maps, that's usually what is happening. So, fair point. Now let's, so thinking about religion, and you saw Derek Thompson's take on religion and Ross Douthat's take on religion. Of course, you always get my take on religion. We saw Jordan Hall, Jonathan Pageau, Brett Weinstein. Now let's listen to these two people talk about religion. Now, again, Tucker Carlson has been in process, I think, of his own religious transformation. I think part of the reason we're seeing people like Tucker Carlson and others sort of becoming more aware of religion, paying more attention to religion. Usually when we talk about conversion, what we're talking about is people are upping the priority with which they are giving religious institutions and communities and practices in their lives. And Tucker, of course, has that demon episode, and I think Douthat, again, I haven't watched. I watched one thing that Tucker did, but I'm not about to start watching him based on this video. But he's more and more religious, and many people are moving in that direction. I think partly because of the recession of modernity, the recession of the post-war consensus. What that does is people then have to go out and they recognize they need to remap. And when they remap some of these larger, older, massive frameworks that has, as Brett Weinstein have been battle tested, these mappings come up. And I think my friend's observation about Brett, which is he's got way more Christianity in him than he realizes, I think is right. And again, I think part of this is because, again, I think Christianity has been colonizing the other religions pretty pervasively for a long time. What I mean by that, Christian code has been seeping in. It's been seeping in culturally and emphases. And I mean, these maps are enormously complex and subtle. So let's listen to some of this.
fundamental principle undergirding the modern West is that we put lineage aside and we collaborate as a people because collaboration.
Okay, now when Brett uses lineage, you sort of have to watch him, because what kind of lineage are you talking about? And I think here he's mostly talking racism and nationality or ethnicity, because Brett is part of this community seeing this Western liberal post-war consensus. Now, it's interesting because what Tucker will do throughout this conversation is basically say, Reform Judaism, Episcopalian, basically the same. And when I talk to a friend like Jonathan Federecci, he'll say, yeah, basically the same. Part of what figuring out how to talk about these religions is enormously difficult, because on one hand, there's a layer of commonality between them. Part of that is the code that's infiltrated. Part of that is just human need for religious practices. In other words, part of it's just human. But part of it is that because the religions have different foundations and because they update their code in different ways. For example, then I take a drink. I don't know when, on my father's side, my ancestors stopped Jewish practice. I don't know when they stopped celebrating the Seder. I don't know when they stopped meeting in the synagogue. I don't know when they stopped identifying as Jews. I don't know any of that. But at some point, they stopped. And I know that because not all of the family emigrated to Western Michigan. My great-great-grandfather married a Dutch girl, which might have put him out of the community. And when they got to Western Michigan, they began attending the Reformed Church and then the Christian Reformed Church where they were. Why? Probably because that's where all the people that spoke Dutch were. So and you see this, great book again. I mentioned it many times, The Alchemy of Air. The inventor of the fixation of nitrogen, which is an incredibly important technological piece. It reworked the world. The world was going to starve at like 4 billion people. But once they could create artificial fertilizer, which not only creates fertilizer, but also explosives, that same inventor invented the gas that gassed the Jews. And he himself was a Jew, but he was trying to become more German. And, you had German unification and people were coming into that mainstream. So 19th century, my great-great-grandfather decided to join the mainstream. But the mainstream for him were Dutch Calvinists. And so, that's where I became Dutch Calvinist in my ancestry. And the Jews have been, assimilating, working this really powerful, vital dance of assimilation and resistance. So they've been an enormously successful group of people, especially in America. But they've also maintained identity and isolation in America. And part of where this whole thing's going to go is Brett Weinstein. We're going to hear quite a bit of biography from him, which I found, I don't have to rant. His stories about his grandfather were fascinating, and we'll get to them, hopefully, if I can shut up long enough. But again, we're dealing with broken adjectives here, and to try to figure out, okay, well, religion. And now in this first part of the video, basically Tucker and Brett are going to say, yeah, what being secular in America means religion is off the table. And a whole lot of people say, absolutely. But then when they're looking for language to talk about what means the most to them and what they think everyone should share and what they think is actually foundational for life in this world, they use religious language, which is exactly the observation that Jordan Peterson made years ago. I can still remember the video where he was talking to an objectivist. And Jordan basically said, when I was working with my patients, I discovered that when we're really getting to the bottom of things, they had to use religious language, because that's the language of the foundation, which is exactly Jordan Hall's point, that that's why it's the queen. She's the context in which the science and the economics and all of these other things. And a big part of the quest of modernity was to say, no, science is the queen, and we're going to transform theology and humanities, and we're going to transform all of this as a science. And quite frankly, that project has failed. That project led to post-modernity that basically looked at it all and said, it's arbitrary, which is why the much deeper, bigger maps are coming back up to the surface. And now we're going to have theological conversations again, because the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus aren't just two events, one of which is disputed. They are the context within the other events and teachings, and everything about Jesus' life is shaped. That's part of, if you look at what Jordan Peterson did, that's part of the point he made, that these things are in fact arenic. The crucifixion and resurrection are arenic, as are the incarnation and ascension. They're all one story. And within that story, the particular teachings of Jesus make sense. If you take those teachings out of that story, some of Jesus' teaching sort of looks like, yeah. But especially if you look at something like the Sermon on the Mount, which is tailored to a Hebraic audience in Jerusalem, quite likely, it really starts looking weird. Again, I know maybe Yosef and I that's it. Yosef and I, we gotta do a conversation. There's gonna be a laundry list. So maybe we'll get Hezi in there too. I don't know. But it's because just y'all have these computers now. Y'all have this AI now. You don't even need Bible study software anymore. The AI will do it for you. Just have the AI spit out all the Beatitudes. Blessed are he, blessed is he, blessed is he. Tons of them in the Psalms, some of them in the Proverbs. Just make a whole big list of them from the Psalms and the Proverbs. There's a few others scattered there. I've been able to do this with my Bible study software for a long time. Just get all those Beatitudes from the Old Testament and then put Jesus' Beatitudes next to them and see if you can't feel the tension. And that tension is all about the crucifixion and resurrection. All right, on with the show.
Is a good thing to do. And you and I also rebel undergirding the modern West is that we put lineage aside and we collaborate as a people because collaboration is a good thing to do. And you and I also remember.
And now part of this will be, well, see, Jewish, Christian, doesn't make a difference. Jewish Episcopalian, same. We grew up in Southern California. We have the same values. It's all context. That religious thing, that doesn't matter. In fact, let's keep it out.
The 80s, 90s, and it just wasn't like this. It's not that there was no bigotry or anything, but we knew what direction we were heading.
And of course, in a way, maybe we're just old men who are like, kids these days, the way they're running the country, they don't know what they're doing. We knew how to do things when we were young.
Totally unacceptable to act like this. It
Right.
was totally unacceptable. And the idea that you would parse someone else's religious views in public. I mean, the working assumption I grew up with as a Southern California WASP was our religious views are right. That's that's our religion. So we think we're right. But let's be honest, everyone's religious views sound pretty kooky when exposed to the light of day. So how about we don't do that? And how about if we have Mormon neighbors or Jewish neighbors, or in my case, Roman Catholic neighbors? What's the...
Didn't mention any Muslims. And this is it. I mean, this is part of the reason, again, go back to that Tim Keller piece that I haven't played it for a while, but there was a consensus not only about religion, but the religions that were on offering had already been sort of molded and shaped, and their sharp edges blunted. And now, of course, he's saying, well, 1980s and 90s, yeah, but 1870s and 80s is that Mormon thing You say, well, yeah, see, we learned from that Mormon thing, and oh, okay. Or did a whole bunch of other things just happen that we figured out how to live together? But does that mean we're going to figure out how to live together with everyone?
Point of like getting into how their doctrine differs from ours. Like, we're confident that ours is right and theirs is wrong, but we can also see them as really great people. And the last thing we're going to do is sit down and be like, let's talk about transubstantiation. That sounds really crazy. It's like, why would you do that unless you wanted to permanently be at war with your neighbors? And all of a sudden,
says the WASP with what's behind him right there? What's behind him right there? Fatima?
I'm reading all this stuff online about various people's religious views, and I have gotten into it myself with the Christian Zionists. I have explained their religious views on camera. I feel bad about doing that. I knew what their views were. I didn't want to talk about it until they were driving America.
In other words, as long as everybody's religion is just sort of this way, well, then we can just deal with regular life. But once you've got Christian Zionists, yeah, there weren't. How many dispensationalists did you meet in La Jolla? Well, maybe if you grew up in Oklahoma, there would have been a few more.
America's foreign policy. Anyway, I just feel like this is not a good road to go down, and we need to.
Okay, now notice again, Derek Thompson. Oh, American foreign policy. I don't know. Is the vice president a dispensational Christian Zionist? I don't think so. Not at all. I think when he converted to Catholicism, that wasn't part of the package that he signed up for with that religion. Paula White, maybe. Hegseth, probably not.
Reestablish a little bit of Anglo-Saxon, sorry to brag about my culture, but restraint here, where there are certain things we don't talk about at dinner, and one of them is your sex life, and another is your religious beliefs. And we've often been made fun of for that, like, oh, you guys are so constipated.
Which is really funny because, no, we're not going to talk about religion. Okay, is not talking about religion part of your religious package? I'd say so. Because your religion and your culture, they're almost synonymous. But now I'm almost done with this part of the clip. And then we're going to get into, suddenly, the only language they have to use to talk about what means the most to them, what they value as their foundation, the assumptions they have, it's religious.
You can never talk about anything real. Yeah, not in public. You don't actually, because it causes fractures that don't heal. That's why we don't do that. Let's get back to that soon.
Couple of points. Well,
sorry.
No, I mean, look, you're being cautious about something. I think we've got a 5-alarm fire on this front.
Yes.
There's a reason we don't do this. And among the many strengths of your monologues,
in other words, the religion that was there in Southern California when these two gents were growing up, it is passing. And Brett says, we have a 5-alarm fire. Okay.
I want to talk about them at some point. But among the many strengths, you're a guy with religious convictions.
Yes.
You make no secret of that. When you talk in your monologues, I hear you talking as a patriot, as a secular person.
Yes.
I hear you talking in a way that I can completely relate to, and it places your religious beliefs exactly where they should be relative to me. I can respect those as your beliefs. You're not asking me to accept them, and they are not informing your beliefs about policy.
So keep your religion at the door. Is that a religious posture? Yeah. And actually, someone just sent me, she's going to be leading a small group in Foolishness of the Greeks with Leslie Newbegin, this great book of his. And she said, have you ever discussed it on your channel? I thought, I really haven't covered that, but it fits in perfectly right here because Leslie Newbegin left England, I think probably, I don't know when he was a missionary in India, probably left in the 50s, the 40s or 50s, right after the Second World War, goes to India, spends his career as an Anglican missionary in India, goes back to the UK when he retires and comes back to a culture and a land he didn't recognize because it had changed so much in that time. And if you want to read someone who is really good on a lot of this stuff, Leslie Newbegin's really, really good, because what are the implicit lines? What is your religion that has these rules about how religions are supposed to be managed? Rules about what is your worldview religion that has rules about what the little secular definement of religion, where that is and how it should be managed and how it's delineated.
We're not allowed to.
We're not allowed to. The founders were very clear about this, and it's not that they didn't have religious beliefs of their own. They were clear about it because it's a slippery slope to hell. It's a slippery slope back into the past, where the only thing that matters is what tribe you're from. Well, I will say one of the
Okay, so that's true. That's true. We're talking about the Enlightenment and what happens in the Enlightenment and what was the context of the Enlightenment, and whether that can, this is the conversation that we're having. But the Enlightenment was in Latin Christendom. And in some ways, the inability of the English to actually manage these issues led to the settling of America and the white Anglo-Saxon Protestantish, as if white Anglo-Saxon Protestant is regular life and doesn't have a culture and doesn't have its own religious foundation. And just because someone from a secularized Jewish foundation, and again, I'm not an enemy of secularism. I think secularism is an amazing Christian invention that was able to sneak Jesus' code all around the world, was able to reorient our moral imaginaries. And so whether or not Bart Ehrman believes in the resurrection of Jesus, am I happy that he still sort of embraces all of this Jesus code? Yes. Am I happy that Brett embraces this Jesus code? Yes. Am I happy that people who don't consider themselves religious? Yes. Well, why is this important? Because if you have a society that has sufficient common code and agreements on all these kinds of things, and who can even translate this into these secular words like values and right and wrong, it works well, and it's worked very well for America. And so I think it's a great thing. And part of me is very anxious about this really nice situation going away. And I'm a little bit older than both of them, but in many ways, I'm in so much agreement with the way that secularity has worked. And again, I'm in agreement with Tim Keller in that I don't think liberalism is going away. I do not think it's going away. I'm not post-liberal in that, but it's going to morph and change. And in that process, other conversations and negotiations are going to have to come out. And I think actually probably Jesus will keep winning a lot of those too. Because, yeah, I think he will.
Things that this is doing to me as I'm trying to review how we ended up here, a place I would not have imagined we could end up.
No, I know.
Is that I don't feel like the Jude.
And so what you're seeing is that all of these guys have maps that have developed, and they're looking out in the world and they're seeing their maps are no longer working. These guys are primed. They are ripe for religious conversion and for fitting things in, which is probably what was motivating Jordan Hall, because Jordan was like, hey, you know, you and I, we did the Game B thing. And just listen to Jordan's story. You can find it in a number of podcasts all over the internet, including mine. And then when he gets to, of all places, to North Carolina and these Christian communities, he's like, oh, this fits. This really works well. And he keeps tinkering with it, and it continues to work well. But again, it's not just working well theory. The life comes first and the theory comes second. Again, go back to Jordan Peterson's first biblical series, episode 1 of the Genesis series. I mean, he walked through a whole bunch of these things. But that's sort of how we work.
Theism that is being represented in the world is familiar. I know that it exists, but it's not what I grew up with. I grew up in a secular Jewish home in which the values were decidedly Jewish and they were explicit. And what we...
See, if I were really going to, I'd have maybe Yosef and Jacob and Chezi with me and say, let's talk about these decidedly Jewish values. Now, of course, Jesus was a Jew. So, and Jesus, like I said, a lot of Jesus' moral teachings, they come through the Old Testament, and a lot of them Jesus sort of, read Bart Ehrman's book. He doesn't believe Jesus was the Son of God or rose from the dead, but he's not dumb.
Was think through difficult issues very carefully. And I will tell you, the Holocaust played a big role in my upbringing.
I'm sure.
Yeah, I mean, this whole conversation just has post-war consensus all over it.
I did not, the point that I became cognizant, understand how recent it was. I now, of course, do, because I've, lived for 57 years. But the idea that this is something that can happen, yes, it can happen here, and you need to understand what happened, and you need to understand who lived, people who told themselves, it's bad, it will pass, they're resettling.
This is his version of apocalypticism and alarmism, and part of the problem is that I've listened to enough Brett over the last 8 years that it can happen here, and the catastrophes, they just keep coming. They just keep piling up. At least Eric sort of sticks with one. Brett is much more polycrisis. And again, Brett and Eric and Jordan Hall were part of that Game B conversation and community, that they're all quite apocalyptic.
As to the east, whatever. Those people died. The people who saw it early didn't. And people who understood it didn't. So in any case, my point is,
can I say
that's a nice thing to say. Of course, the complexity. I could say, my great-great-grandfather saw it really early. No, he didn't. He probably he saw starvation coming, which is why he moved and sent his son to North America and said, "You get in there and get us a visa, and we'll all come, and we'll figure out how to eat in the new world and have children." And they did. So anyway, but all right.
As an Episcopalian, and this is not a compliment to the Episcopal Church, but it not so different from Reformed Judaism. Reformed Judaism was actually kind of modeled on the Episcopal churches. You may or may not know, but it was. Yeah, Temple Bethel is kind of like an Episcopal church, sort of, or started that way. German Jew.
What Jacob Federecci told me 5 years ago.
Rationalists, let's explain this. Let's think through all the hard problems. De-emphasis on the miraculous, emphasis on the rational. Very similar. The one lesson that I got from hearing about the Holocaust constantly growing up in a very Jewish school was exactly what you said right then, is that don't lie to yourself. I'm not Jewish, so I wasn't thinking about it in those terms, but like the lesson is universally applicable. Like, you see the leaves changing, it's probably fall. And like, don't tell yourself it's not. And Hannah Arendt, who I was, always loved Hannah Arendt.
Back to my conversation with Pageau and Vervaeke, the Holocaust, atomic bomb, civil rights movement, Vietnam, these things remapped the religious assumptions of our culture. You don't want to use the word religion, use worldview, but it's the basic, very deep layers of maps.
And I just think Hannah Arendt was like really a kind of a genius and a non-conventional thinker. But that was kind of the lesson that I took from her books, not just Eichmann in Jerusalem, but she wrote a lot of magazine pieces, which I read. And she kept saying that, like, just don't lie to yourself. And I have taken that my whole life, and maybe to the extreme. Like, I'm probably too jumpy about certain.
The problem with Christians, they're always worried about hell. And so that fear of hell just drives everything that they do. It remaps their whole world. The problem with post-war consensus people? It's the fear of the recurring Holocaust. It's the fear of the nuclear war. It's the fear of you're going to have, there's a function, there's a big slot where you're going to slide an anxiety that you have about the world. Now, it might be individual. It may be your father died young of a heart attack, or your mother had cancer, or you're living on the coast of Florida and your aunt got wiped out by a hurricane. You're going to have anxiety.
And things, but like, look at the trend lines. And I would say we should be panicked, not just for Jews, though.
I remember when I was in college, I don't think the world is going to get to the year 2000. I see signs of the Antichrist all over. Did you ever read Hal Lindsey? 1980, Countdown to Armageddon? You know, like the bear, and just ask AI about that book. It'll be fun.
For Jews, but for all of us, because tribalism kills everybody in the end, and we should be panicked about its rise.
You know what kills everybody? Death. You know how many people death comes to? Everybody.
Panicked.
Oh, absolutely. We are looking at a return to an evolutionary mode of being. And to give it its due, I will just say that the way history worked until 5 minutes ago, until the invention of the modern West, was that populations displaced.
That sure sounded like a religious comment. All up until history, everything was horrible until the modern West. Now, you might also look at it through another lens and say, well, let's imagine we are living in an imperial world, and since the end of the Second World War, we've pretty much had an empire, and the rules that you live by in America in terms of restraint on government and due process and all of those things, Americans have them. Do the rest of the world have them? Why in the Roman Empire did everybody but the Romans pay taxes?
Each other, or they get displaced. That's the game. And unfortunately, I now see, first of all, I see myself being spoken for as a Jew. I find Benjamin Netanyahu speaking for me.
Wait a minute. Wait. What was that Jewish thing? I thought all of that was supposed to go away. Why is he speaking for you? He's an Israeli, not an American. Although, you know, it's the whole chatter about, you know, did Bibi get us into this war? I mean, that was also in the other conversation.
And I don't know what I am supposed to resign from so that he no longer has that right. I don't know where it comes from.
Well, what most people do is they stop going to that church because, well, I can't be Roman Catholic with those priests doing that. I can't go to this church if that pastor says that. Oh, but ethnicity. What about lineage? I thought that lineage was a piece of the past. Now suddenly the lineage is important.
What's more, I want to know where the tradition that I grew up with, which I will defend, went.
Yeah.
I feel like, you know, I've been sort of looking into it. I'm not, you know, deeply embedded in Judaism. I have a good friend, an increasingly good friend who is a scholar of Jewish mysticism. I learn a lot from him about these various things. I also increasingly realize that my tradition emerges from Maimonides, who, you know, I barely knew who Maimonides was, but he was a 12th century philosopher, Jewish philosopher, and medical doctor in Spain. And
Are you watching it happen? The post-war consensus map is crumbling. Bigger maps are coming up from below. Jewish mysticism. Mysticism. What's probably the most mystical of the branches of Christianity? Starts with a big O.
He had this hard-headed, very rigorous Jewish approach to thinking, and he was actually well respected outside of Judaism because he was so insightful. And in any case, my point is, we are seeing a very, in my opinion, foolish version of this tradition, and a very dangerous one, because it sort of hybridizes these, I think most of the, and I don't like the term Zionism because it morphs.
The real tradition has been lost. We need a reformation to get back to Maimonides.
On you, right? Sometimes Zionism just means that you believe that the state of Israel should exist, in which case, okay, I'll sign up for that. Sometimes it means that you want to see it expanded in some way. And it's like, hey, hold on, wait a minute. We've got a lot riding on not just overwhelming people because they come from a different branch of the tree. So no, I'm not signed up for that.
I don't know if it's a little fair to say that the current wars of Israel were just happened because people came from a different branch of the tree. I think October 7 was kind of important. I think the rockets coming in were kind of important. And really what's interesting about the state of Israel, to the limited degree that I know it, usually by listening to Israelis from the corner, is that they sort of tried to take a little bit of Southern California and plant it right there in that neighborhood. And that would just be regular life, right? I mean, why not have a Disneyland in Tel Aviv? That would be cool. It didn't work out that way.
But my sense is here's what's
exactly, I'm just laughing. I wish I could put it as crisply as you just said, that those are exactly my views.
It's crazy.
I know.
And so I think
it's almost as if these two share a religion.
This is the thing that I haven't heard anybody else say it. Maybe others have. But the thing that is so confusing about what's going on in the present, what's now begun in Iran, is if I just look at it like an anthropologist, that's a holy war. It's a holy war, but it's being led by secular Jews.
Exactly.
And it is that secularness that cloaks it, that makes it look like something it isn't. And I'm not saying, look, I am no fan of...
So what exactly is secularity in that word picture? Is secularity actually a thing in itself? Or is secularity sort of a lubrication that allows people of different worldviews to negotiate certain agreements?
The Iranian theocracy, right? I couldn't be more frightened by that structure for the same reason I don't want to see a holy war initiated by Israel. Frankly, holy war has no place in a world where we should be moving towards the values of the modern...
Now, I don't know, so correct me if I'm wrong in the comments. I don't know that this is a holy war. I mean, maybe holy in front of war is also a broken adjective. I think this is probably more a war about these people are going to nuke us and these other people rocket us, and the people who might nuke us in the future have been sending the rockets to the people who are rocketing us, and we're just tired of the whole darn thing and we'd like to kill them. That seems to be the war that I see, but correct me if I'm wrong.
West.
It's hard to resolve them. Very hard.
Well, I mean, it gets resolved by one population displacing another period at the end. And the point is, you know, if you want to talk about the Holocaust, that's what it was, right?
Of course.
It was a population taking advantage of the fact that there was another population that couldn't defend itself, that had some wealth. And the point is, you can create growth by exterminating those people and taking their stuff, right? That's what it is. And that's a go-to strategy. So to the extent that anybody on earth is advocating for, hey, let's paint...
But again, and I'm not a fan of this, but is the motivation of these current wars to take stuff? I think it's much more, let's, in sort of the American way, let's at least blunt them or mute them or move them or get them out of here so they won't bother us, so we can just continue to make more stuff.
Those people as demons, and then we'll exterminate them and take their stuff, right? That is not a way the world can go on. Now, it did go on that way, but it did not go on that way in the nuclear era. We can't play that game anymore. It has to end. And I'm going to I don't think that this discussion is going to be a win for me in the world. I think I'm going to pay dearly for having had it.
Really?
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. But
I just live on another planet. This seems like the most reasonable, moderate American conversation you could ever have.
That's the problem with it.
Yeah, I guess I don't understand the country as well as I thought I did.
Well, no, I think you and I understand a version of the country that works to an extent. Again, it's a prototype. It doesn't work brilliantly, but it works. And we understand the aspiration of what it's supposed to do if it really works, right? And of course, that
sounds a lot like a religion.
That's hard to let go of once you've seen it. And we are being forced to let go of it. And, you know, I will say I've been accused in very close quarters of having a martyr complex. I do not. My life is personally so good, I am not eager to leave it one
I feel the same way.
instant sooner than I have to. However, I'm also aware that what it is to be a man is to face the fact that there are hills worth dying for. And I don't want to, but the point is we have to defend the hill that is the modern West, and we have to defend it from this impulse to view the world through a lens of what lineage do you come from and what are we entitled to, and, you know, deeds to land that go back millennia or whatever it is. That's not the way this can work if we are to continue as a species. So I don't know how.
In other words, I'm not going to call it a religion, but it's existential. Period. That's a hill I'm willing to die on. But if you go back over my sermons, you know, Peter says to Jesus, I'll die for you. But when it comes down to the Garden of Gethsemane, what really played out was, I'll kill for you. That's human.
We can turn down the temperature and get people who have already chosen a team to rethink whether that was a reasonable thing to do, but they are signing us up for an unthinkable conflagration. And, you know, to have Benjamin Netanyahu in a position to steer the United States, and I think that is what has happened. You can tell that by what Marco Rubio has said. And if we take the mild version, you know, where he says it was the timing that was forced by Israel, okay, that's still unacceptable. If we take the more aggressive interpretation, and the fact is we were forced into this because Israel wanted it, that is completely unacceptable. And we cannot survive this way. And I don't know how to say this delicately, but your sense that anti-Semitism is being amped up, and it seems essentially deliberate. And you've heard, as you said, from Bill Kristol, the idea that must circulate somewhere that a bit of anti-Semitism is good because it reminds Jews of who they are. We don't need that reminder. We can be very academic. We can understand these things based on patterns of history, and we do. So we don't need this amped up. So my point is, I also feel an obligation as a Jew to stand up for the other set of values that I think are better and that really characterized Judaism, at least in America, much more so than today.
Didn't the founding fathers say, keep your religion at the door? It doesn't work. But that doesn't mean that you have to have everything be a religious war. I mean, but my point here is that early on the video, it's just founding fathers. And now they get to this point in the video, it's existential. We're not going to call this thing that we grew up in on our playground in La Jolla, in California, when we were growing up in the 80s, we're not going to call that a religion, but those are the lenses through which we see the world. That is the highest thing and how to get there. And we could die on that hill or kill on that hill.
We were growing up, right? That careful tradition, the one that holds the values very deeply, would not create false portrayals in order to advance a political agenda, much less a military one.
It was the world's, I'm very familiar with Reform Judaism is what I grew up around. And I'm very familiar with it, certainly with the tone of it. And it was always like, It's like the least aggressive.
Was that a racial thing he just did?
It was just very much in tone and spirit, like the church that I grew up in. You like ask a question and be like, well, it's hard. You know, it would always be like, it's hard.
Well, that's...
And you could make fun of that, and I've certainly made fun of it a lot with my own church, but you're not going to get a lot of extremists coming out of that, like, period. It acknowledged the complexity of every human decision and of the human condition, and I think there's something nice about that.
Well, this is uncomfortable. I don't think I'm talking about Reformed Judaism, though I think the thing I'm talking about would have been found in many...
Did you grow up going to temple?
No.
Oh, wow.
Well, I will tell you, I felt a little left out by that. My family was secular, atheist, and, you know, decidedly scientific.
So you were not bar mitzvahed?
No, I wasn't.
Oh, wow.
But I wanted to be. And what happened, I mean, this will tell you a lot about me. What happened was I asked to go to Hebrew school for the purpose of being bar mitzvahed. I thought it seemed like a thing I should do, even though I wasn't a believer. A lot of Jews aren't believers.
Yeah.
That's one of the strange things about Judaism. It's not really about belief in that sense, or it's not about faith. It can be. For many it is, but for many it's not. And you remain Jewish. You don't lose your Jewishness just because.
Right.
And part of it is because what happened with Christianity was that before Christianity sort of goes through the Roman Empire, your religion was where you were from. You got it from your ethnic group, you got it from your tribe, you got it from your polis, you got it from, that was your religion. You got it from your nation, as we call it. That was your religion. Christianity goes through, and Islam too, and now suddenly your ethnicity and your religion are two different things. But when you get to lineage, those lineages are important because it's amazing. Just pay attention to how much of this conversation is about the people who raised them. It's like the religion of daddy and mommy and grandpa. And this is a beautiful story that he tells. I mean, I'm not trying to mock or kneecap or do anything bad to either of these guys. But the story he tells is a beautiful one. And now we're going to attach something like a religious label to it or an ethnic label to it. And
you're secular. So I asked, and my parents saw no reason not to and signed me up, and I went. And I remember asking questions about things that didn't add up in the portrayal that we were being given.
Okay, there's tensions in the maps. There is dissonance.
And I expected it to be like the family dinner table. On the family dinner table, you could ask any question and it was taken seriously and
that's
properly
how I grew
addressed.
Up. Same.
Okay, that little piece right there, that little artifact, that little practice, is that a religious practice? Now you might say, hey, wait a minute, Vander Clay. Some Christians do it, some Christians don't. Some Muslims do it, some Muslims don't. Some Jews do it, some Jews don't. Therefore, it can't be religious. Oh, okay, if those are your categories. But if your category is that which is highest and how to get there, then this process, this practice of dialogos, of, you know, and hey, I'm Mr. Estuary here. So I love this. And if, if somebody puts together an estuary conference and Brett gets invited, I hope he comes. And I hope he doesn't only come, but I hope he goes into an estuary group right from the start and goes through it, because it'll be like, this is what I'm looking for. I wasn't looking for all of the rules and the traditions and the yeses and the nos. It's like, wow, okay, fair enough. But you're also a kid, and you've labeled plenty of rules and traditions and yeses and nos that you didn't put in a religious box. You just put it in a moral box throughout this whole conversation.
And that was not the response that I got. I got a response that was basically designed to sort of, I mean, I now know what the response is because I've seen bad professors do it, right? You know, the professor who doesn't really know their subject doesn't want to be asked questions that were...
So that too is not just a religious box. That's a human box. Like pretty much everything we've been talking about here, including war.
Feel that?
Parents are the same way.
Well, it's funny. My house wasn't like this.
Neither was mine. My father would answer any question and never judge you for asking it.
Yeah, my family was like that, and my grandfather particularly so. My grandfather was very good with kids. He took them very seriously. He was tremendously fun. It wasn't like he was a super serious guy. He was very fun and very adventurous. Take you out into climb mountains and stuff with him. But anyway, you could ask him any question about anything, and he would answer.
I love this story. I love everything he said about his grandfather. That way, Brett and myself and Tucker, we all sort of had the same religion in that sense.
It as well as he could, and then you'd ask the next question. And when you finally got to the place where he couldn't answer the question, he'd say, "I don't know," and here's what we might do to figure out the answer. Anyway, it was like having the world's best, personal tutor or mentor or something like that.
What a blessing. What did he do for a living?
Well, he was kind of I hate to say it, but he was either a failure in the sense of doing things for a living. He was too principled. He got blacklisted for his political beliefs. He was a chemist, went to college but didn't finish it, got hired away, I think, by RCA Records to develop, the first vinyl to replace the lacquer records that had existed. So anyway, he worked in industry, and eventually he got a job in pollution control. He was an inspector inspecting factories. He was a very committed environmentalist, and so he was inspecting factories for pollution and things like that. And then Proposition 13 happened and he got fired. So he wasn't successful in the sense of a career. However, I do think the real meaning, his name was Harry, he's a great guy. The real meaning of Harry is that he was very wise about many things. He had seen a lot and he understood a lot, and he was wicked smart. And that he passed this on to any young person who would listen, especially me and Eric, but really my friends all remember him too, right? I barely remember my friends' grandparents. I met a bunch of them, but they were old and it was hard to relate to them and all of that. But my grandfather made an impression on every friend of mine he ever met. And they asked about him right up until his death. How's Harry doing?
How old were you when he passed?
It was 2000.
Oh, he lived a long time.
Yeah, he did. He made it to 94.
Wow.
Yeah. But
all right, I'm gonna teach you a little Jedi pastor trick that I do. I just did it to you. I just, I've been picking and pointing and poking at Brett and Tucker and Derek, and I really do love Ross, but I've been being kind of a jerk to these guys this whole video. But notice I just let that video play with Harry. Why? That was a holy moment. That was a sacred thing. I'm like, if I can get some of that Harry religion into you, that's what I want. Well, is that Christianity? To me, it is. I think so. But I'm not going to fight you on that. But there's wisdom and there's truth. Is that secular? Yeah, I guess you can call it secular. But that Harry story, there was a holy moment right there. What do you mean holy? That's a religious word. Yeah, it is. It's the words we use when we have to say something that is the most meaningful and the deepest and the highest. I mean, the deepest and the highest, they're both, the waters surround the earth. But so as a pastor, it's like, you're going to forget all of the little nitpicky, jerky things I said through this video. I bet you remember Harry. Because you saw something in him that'd be like, boy, if I get to be a grandpa, I want to be like Harry. And I'd say, you do it. I don't care if you're terribly successful in your vocation. I don't care if you're terribly successful in your political aspirations. I don't really care about that so much. It's the pallbearers, as my friend Rod keeps saying. And that's, he always sort of dismisses it when he says it, but I know that's the stuff right there. That's the holiness right there, because you go to a funeral and it's a holy place. And is it secular because it's like holy for Muslims? And no, that's holy. And you can fail at all these other things, but there's a hierarchy there. I mean, if you fail at all these things but you succeed in your marriage, good for you. If you succeed with your grandkids, if you actually manage to have grandkids, good for you. And you might want to be a grandpa like Harry.
Anyway, I've forgotten exactly why we were talking about Harry.
See, it was so holy. It even possessed the storyteller. He forgot where he was because Harry inhabited him. And that's beautiful. You can forget everything else in this video. Just remember Harry.
Just a question of what the culture was in my house. It was secular. It was intellectually committed and rigorous. And it wasn't trying to be mild, right? It was trying to do the right thing based on what the patterns of the world and the evidence suggested the right thing was. And I don't see that in the culture at the moment.
No,
and I don't understand how, Netanyahuism or whatever it is has overwhelmed it, right? At the very least, look, you can do what you want. That's, our personal freedom is effectively sacred in the West, as it should be.
What did he just say? Our personal freedom is sacred? That is another funny religious word.
But I feel entitled to continue that tradition and not be suspected of a moral defect for doing so.
Can't control your judges.
I couldn't agree more, of course. In fact, it's the thing I feel most strongly. And I think my right...
most strongly about it. Again, wouldn't that be religious?
To express my views, my conscience, to defend myself.
My conscience, existential, defending myself. It's religious. It's religious, religious, religious.
I mean, I think the Bill of Rights, these are natural rights bestowed by God. That's my opinion. It's my deepest belief. So I'm totally committed to everything you just said. And I grew
what they say about the Founding Fathers, in a way, not completely, they sort of give away here.
Up weirdly in a non-Jewish household, but also secular household with exactly the same vibe. My father was a wonderful man and very rigorous intellectually and also extremely open-minded. Like extremely. It was never like, I can't believe you think that. Never. And that was a massive advantage for me.
I don't know if that's open-minded or he just has a non-judgmental posture, especially towards his children, which is a good thing. But again, even that word, I mean, you're going to have to dig out judging. Well, no, he was judging, but it's not condemning.
I do think that world is dying because I think the systems are played out and the systems that I love and support. Liberal democracy. I think it's not growing anywhere in the world.
Maybe that was the wrong layer to imagine that institutionally the tradition that you're so desperate to preserve could best be preserved. Just because it had been preserved in that institution doesn't mean that it started in that institution, because I would argue it started in the religious institutions and eventually pervaded the political, because that's how people work. It started in the grandpas, and it started in the dads, and it started in this weird religious place that all of us have. And then you get into the details. So anyway, hope I wasn't too much of a jerk. Leave a comment. Let me know what you think.